Okay, chapter 19, fair housing. We only have 2 left, 19 and 20, and then we're done because we've already covered 21, which is closing the transaction. Fair housing is obviously something that you're going to need to pay a lot of attention to if you work in residential real estate. Right there is probably one of the biggest test items that, believe it or not, people screw up, is that these are housing laws. They only apply when someone is purchasing or renting housing. These laws, I think what happens is when you talk about laws about discrimination, people assume, oh, well, fair housing means you can never discriminate against somebody based on their race. No, that's not what fair housing means. It means you can never discriminate against them on their race when they're making a housing decision. It only applies when we're talking about housing. So for example, in commercial real estate, does anything that we're going to talk about in this chapter apply to commercial real estate transactions? No, it doesn't. Pretty much everything that we say in this chapter is illegal would be completely legal in a commercial real estate transaction. That does not mean it's nice, but that means it's not illegal. And that's where they're going to test you on. They're going to test you on. We would love to hope that nobody would ever discriminate in any case for any reason in any real estate transaction. But at the same time, you got to know where to draw the line. Like, for example, earlier in chapter 15, at the end of chapter 15, we talked about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. You remember that discussion? The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, when is that in effect? What kinds of transactions would that deal with? The Equal Credit Opportunity Act. When somebody's borrowing money. So what it means is there's separate laws that cover separate types of transactions. The Fair Housing Act only covers residential transactions. Now, the first law that you need to know about that created some type of fairness in housing is actually not the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act came along 100 years later. The first law that deals with fairness and equity in housing is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And yes, you need to be familiar with that law. You need to be familiar with the year it was passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1866. What had just ended in 1866? Slavery. Well, and specifically the Civil War. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed in response to the end of the Civil War. It was part of the Reconstruction process. This is still the law of the land. Just because it was passed in 1866 does not mean it has gone away. And it's still an important law because of this last bullet point down here. And you better know this about this last bullet point. This is the only law, probably the only law we talk about in the whole class that has no exceptions. None. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is very simple. It made it illegal to discriminate in this country on the basis of race. So, let me ask you a question. Can you discriminate on the basis of race in a commercial real estate transaction? No. Because I just said the Civil Rights Act made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of what? Race. And there's no exceptions to it. This is not the Federal Fair Housing Act. This is a law that says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, period, for any reason. I don't care what you're doing. If you're playing hopscotch in the parking lot and somebody says you can't play with us because you are insert race right here, you just violated the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 applies to everything and everybody, everywhere, all the time. It has no exceptions whatsoever. That's what makes it a much stronger law than, for example, the Fair Housing Act. Because the Fair Housing Act was meant to apply to a very narrow set of guidelines, whereas the Civil Rights Act of 1866 applies to everything all the time. So here's what we mean about that. It might be legal to discriminate, for example, in a commercial real estate transaction. It might be legal to discriminate against someone because of their religion. Not nice, but legal. It would not be legal to discriminate against them because of their religion if they were buying a house, because the Fair Housing Act would protect them. But if the question was race, if you were discriminating on the basis of race, it would be illegal in which situation? All of them. Because race falls under the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and never has any exceptions. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay? So make sure you understand that. All right? Now, the Federal Fair Housing Act, which is the law that this whole chapter deals with, was actually passed in 1968. You might see on the test where it says as amended in 1974 or as amended in 1988. There's nothing special about those years except to say that the Act has changed over time. What they've done is added to it. The original Fair Housing Act only created 4 protected classes: race, color, religion, and national origin. That was it. So originally when the Fair Housing Act first passed, those were the only things that were sort of off topic in residential real estate. When you were either selling or leasing, don't forget the leases, selling or leasing real estate for residential purposes, that was the original 4. Now you don't need to know that those were the original 4. What you need to know is that there are now what? 7 of them. And that's all these amendments are. The amendment in 1974 added gender and handicapping status, and in 1988 it added what we call familial status, which is the last one that was added. So it's taken, several amendments or changes to get us to the point of 7 protected classes. My guess is that at some point in the relatively near future we will see an additional change in the Federal Fair Housing Act, because we have seen changes in each state's Fair Housing Act. Each state has its own Fair Housing Act, and many states now have many more than 7 protected classes. I believe California has 11 now, protected classes of individuals in their Fair Housing Act. You need to know all 11. I'm kidding. You don't have to know that. You just have to know the 7 federal ones. Okay? And the 7 federal ones, as we talk about them, what you need to know about them is that when we say something is a protected class, yes, it means you can't discriminate in a housing search, so that could be a purchase or a rental. It means you can't discriminate on those 7 things, but it means you can't even talk about those 7 things, because the law defines you as a real estate broker talking about those things as being discriminatory. Because discriminatory works both ways. Discriminatory doesn't mean keeping somebody out, it also means keep letting somebody in on the basis of one of those 7 protected classes. In other words, in the eyes of the Fair Housing Law, it's just as bad to say, I don't want to live near an Asian family, as it is to say, oh, I would love to live near Asian families. Those 2 statements are exactly the same in the eyes of the Fair Housing Law. Does that make sense for everybody? You may not think of them as the same, but your opinion and my personal opinion don't matter. They think of them as the same. So what it means is when we say something is a protected class and you're in a housing search, what can you say about that thing? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. As a topic, it is off limits. Is everybody okay with that? That's the idea of the Fair Housing Act. So here are the 7 protected classes: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and handicapping status. Those are the 7. Now, the best way to remember this, as you've heard people mention, is fresh corn. Just drop the vowels out. No E and no O. Here's how somebody taught me that a long time ago. Take equal opportunity out of fresh corn and you've got the protected classes. Because you take out the E and you take out the O, and everybody thinks of equal opportunity with fair housing. So take out the equal opportunity and you're left with just the consonants: familial status, race, sex, handicapping status, color, religion, and national origin. So make sure you're able to list all 7 of those. And know they're only protected if we're doing what? Selling or leasing what? Not real estate. That's not residential. Housing. It has to be housing. You've got to remember that. These protected classes do not apply when you're talking about commercial real estate, or you're talking about lending, or you're talking about shopping for tires. There are 1,000 things that these don't apply to. They only apply when somebody is searching for housing for themselves. So let me ask you a question. If you're going out and you're meeting with a developer who's looking at developing an area, a subdivision, and the first thing that developer wants to know is, well, can you tell me what the racial makeup is of people that live in this area? Can you answer that question? Yes! Absolutely. And that's why I have to scream it at you. Because you're not in what kind of a transaction. And that is exactly what they will do to you on a test. I have to emphasize it like that, because that's what they're going to do. Because you take such a simplistic look at this thing, and you sit there and you tell yourself, oh, you can never talk about it, you can never talk about it. Yes, you can. Because the Fair Housing Act doesn't come into play unless you're talking about what? Residential real estate. The only time the Fair Housing Act is in play is when the person you're talking to is looking for housing for themselves. Does that make sense? There are going to be plenty of these conversations that you have in commercial real estate that would be completely inappropriate to have. Now, I'm not saying you should have them or shouldn't have them. I'm saying you need to understand where the line in the sand is, because that's what you're going to be tested on. I hope I didn't scare you too much. But I have to do that, because that's what I see people miss all the time on these fair housing questions. Because all you do is you program yourself, oh, I can't discriminate, can't discriminate, can't discriminate, can't discriminate. And you just get in that loop. It's a very narrow definition, folks. It's only in play when you're looking for what? Residential real estate, housing. It's the only time these laws are in effect. Okay? So, in other words, sex is only protected. I shouldn't even go there. Sorry. No. Familial status is only a protected class when you're talking to somebody who's either looking to buy or rent housing for themselves. That's why it's called fair housing. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay, good. So, let's talk about this familial status one, because it's the one that the name doesn't really convey what it means. Let me tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean marriage. It doesn't mean lack of marriage. It doesn't mean, are you dating somebody? Are you seeing somebody? How many people live in the house? It doesn't mean any of those things. Familial status means children. It's children that are the protected class. Children are a protected class. Now, what do we say about something being a protected class? It means we cannot do what? Don't use that word discriminate, because that doesn't really tell me anything. We can't do what? Talk about them in a residential transaction. You can't discuss them in a residential transaction in the sense of helping somebody. Now, can you discuss them as a generic topic because somebody says, oh, I got to take my kids to a soccer game? Of course, that's not what the law is talking about. But if somebody is trying to tailor their search around children, and do people often try to tailor their search around children? Yep. Absolutely. You can't help them with that, because this is a protected class. If somebody asks you this question, well, is this a good neighborhood for kids? Are they trying to tailor their housing search around a protected class? Yes. Yes. Can you help with that? No. That's what makes this one such a tough one. Because and so here was the idea behind it. The idea behind it, and what you find with fair housing, is much more about rentals than it is sales. Traditionally speaking, most people would sell to anybody. But when you start renting, it becomes a whole different story. Have y'all ever noticed that? When they talk about renting out a house, somebody's house, they all of a sudden want to know who it is and what they look like and how much they make and where they want to know everything about the person who's going to be renting from. Does that make sense? If you're selling, if they got the money, you don't care. But this comes up in rentals all the time. Why do you think children became a protected class? People don't like them. Who doesn't like them? What people? She said she doesn't. Old people don't like them. Think about the housing search. What group of people don't like children? How about landlords? Landlords don't like children. Why do landlords not like children? They tear it up. They tear everything up, don't they? And so, one of the things that happened repeatedly over the years is that landlords would say, no children allowed. So families with children were routinely shut out of housing searches, particularly rental housing searches. That makes sense for everybody? So that's why this was added as a protected class. What that means is that since children are a protected class, you're not supposed to talk with that potential buyer, that potential tenant about whether or not they have what? Children. Because you shouldn't be guiding that search on the basis of children. From the standpoint of the Fair Housing Law, children is no different than race, is no different than religion. You wouldn't say to somebody, well, you shouldn't live in this neighborhood because it's not a good neighborhood for Jewish families, or it's not a good neighborhood for Muslim families, or it's not a good neighborhood for Christian families. You would never say that to somebody. That's the same thing as saying, well, this is not a great neighborhood for kids in the eyes of the law, because kids are just as much of a protected class as those other things. Does that make sense for everybody? You may not like it. I didn't say you had to like it, but it is what the law says. And it's going to be the hardest thing to deal with. Because what's one of the first questions that people will want to ask you as part of their housing search? How many kids live in the neighborhood? Is this a good neighborhood for kids? You know, are my kids going to be happy here? What are my kids going to have to do here? People ask tons of questions about children. So this is the hardest one to dodge. Now, here's the thing. Just like any other protected class, there's no law that says the consumer can't discriminate. There's no law that says the tenant or the buyer can't make it. Can the buyer choose to not buy a house because they don't like the race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, or handicapping status of the people next door? Yeah. Absolutely. That is perfectly within their right to discriminate. So, is the buyer allowed to choose this neighborhood because they think it's a good neighborhood for kids? Yeah. Yes. That is very different than you helping them make that choice on that basis. Do you see the difference there? They can choose to employ whatever criteria they want. You can't assist. You can't provide an assist. So, when they ask you, is this a good neighborhood for? I don't care what comes out of their mouth next. The best thing to do is redirect it back to them. Let them decide what is a good neighborhood for that thing, and you'll always be okay. Does that make sense for everybody? So when somebody asks me, well, is this a good neighborhood for kids? What I would say is, first of all, I have to let them know it's an inappropriate question. That's going to be on the test too. You can't. It's not enough to ignore it. You can't ignore them. You have to let them know that you can't answer the question. So I would say, you know, believe it or not, I'm not allowed to answer that question. But what I can do is answer more specific questions about the neighborhood. Are there specific things that you're interested in for a neighborhood? Because see, I haven't made the decision for them at that point. I haven't decided what is good or bad for kids. I've simply said, you tell me what you want in a neighborhood and I'll tell you if I can answer the question. Does that make sense? That's what you want to get to. So what if they say, well, is there a playground in the neighborhood? Can I answer that question? Sure. Because there's nothing protected about playgrounds. Well, is it near a school? Can I answer that question? Sure. Absolutely, because schools are not a protected class. So there are certainly, what you need to do is get them to the point where they're asking you about specifics so that you can just provide them yes or no answers. We good with that?
What if they were to ask, like, about, you know, like the school district? I mean, you can't really say, like, oh yeah, this school, like, I live across the street and goes to the school. Yeah, I couldn't say, like, the school's terrible, right?
Why not?
No, you can't. So is that how you answer the question?
Well, the question was, you could, or what your statement was, I couldn't really say that Daniels is a terrible school. Sure you could. Now, keep in mind, you're going to be held responsible for making sure that's an accurate statement. There's no law that says you can't because schools aren't protected classes. So you can talk about schools, you just can't talk about the things that attend the schools. There's a difference between them. There's a difference between them. Now what you couldn't say is, Well, you know, the kids that go to Daniels are kind of, you don't want to be around them. That would very much be off limits as a statement, because now you're talking about a protected class of people. But if somebody said, well, I've heard good things about Daniels, and you said, well, you know, it's a pretty good school as far as I know. There are some rankings available, and I'd be glad to point you to those. There'd be nothing wrong with that sort of an answer for that question. Okay, that's a really good question, by the way. Everybody good so far? So familial status is a tough one. Handicapping status. Well, obviously, if handicapping status is a protected class, that means we cannot discriminate on the basis of any kind of a handicap, which sort of goes, I think, without saying for most people. However, what most people are unfamiliar with, and we've talked about them one time before, but I'm going to remind you of them again, is the difference between an accommodation and a modification. An accommodation and a modification. One involves changing your operating procedures. One involves changing the property. Which one is changing the property? That's a modification. Which one involves changing the way you operate? That's an accommodation. Okay? The law, and this is very similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Remember, that's what we talked about, those two words previously. We talked about it in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which governs what kind of properties. Not residential, but what? Public property, so mostly commercial properties. Well, now we're talking about the Fair Housing Act. So, not only is it illegal to discriminate on the basis of somebody's handicapping status, you also have to be willing to make accommodations or modifications to accommodate someone with a handicap. But you need to put this in your notes, or at least point yourself to it, because it's already in here. This very different treatment between the ADA and the Fair Housing Act as far as paying for stuff. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, who pays for accommodations or modifications? Is it the landlord or the tenant, for example? The landlord. Under the Fair Housing Act, who do you think is going to pay for modifications or accommodations? The landlord or the tenant? The tenant. So you're never obligated, when we're talking about a residential piece of property, a housing transaction, the owner of the property is never obligated to pay for changes to the property. So if the tenant needs a wheelchair ramp, for example, who would pay for the wheelchair ramp? The tenant would. The only thing the owner can't do, and this is important, is say no. They can't refuse the modification, ever. If it is a reasonable modification and the tenant is willing to pay for it, the owner must allow it to be made. What if you're renting out a house that's in historic Oakwood and the front porch railing is of irreplaceable historic value and they need to take it down so they can put a wheelchair ramp in? What do you say? Yes or no?
Yes.
You say yes.
You see, yes, but then there would probably be stipulations to how they're allowed to go about doing it if it's historic.
No, there won't be.
Really?
No, there won't be. They will put up the cheapest, most economical thing they possibly can, and you will let them do it. And it will destroy the historic character of that porch, and you will lose the value of that, and you will let them do it. Because you agreed to all of that when you decided to place that property for what? For rent. Because that's what the law says. So my answer to somebody who came to me with that type of a property that had intrinsic historic value would be, don't what? Don't rent it. Don't rent it. What if they wanted to go through and rip out the doors because they needed 32-inch wide passageways in the house? And those were all historic hand-worked moldings. What would you have to say? Yes. You don't have a choice. If that tenant's willing to pay for it, the answer is yes. And so you've got to weigh all that out before you decide to even rent the property out. Yep. Sorry.
Now I have like 3 questions. Well, one was I stayed in the Airbnb.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to walk up the steps and all that. But what if I'd have called up and said, I wanna stay, did my little thing, and when I'm handicapped, I'm gonna put a ramp in.
They would have to allow it.
I mean, I'm gonna stay there for 2 days, but I want to stay there.
You're gonna pay for it.
And before I get there, I'm paying for this, they would have to do that.
They'd have to allow it. Everybody get your question? He basically said, what if he was doing VRBO or Airbnb, and he's gonna stay somewhere for a week, and he was willing to pay for a ramp because he wanted to stay in that particular property, but they have to allow it, and the answer is yes.
Another question.
And, interestingly enough, on something like a ramp, on any exterior change like that, the tenant does not have to pay to put it back. So like you would not have to pay to have the ramp removed after the.
So I stay there and say, see you later.
And the ramp stays after you leave. That's right.
Say that I'm leasing the property for a long-term lease, and of course a handicapped person comes, and of course I don't want to do it because it's just going to cause problems. But then they make the offer. Well, I will make the modifications at my cost. That I would just personally, I would probably just find another way, especially if I have a historic house. I would just find another way to. This is another reason why. Well, I've already rented it to somebody.
Well, I mean, and again, you open yourself up to all kinds of. Trust me, there are people who are very aware of their rights under the Fair Housing Act, and they will file a complaint, and you will be fined $5,000. That's the automatic fine from not from the Real Estate Commission, from the North Carolina Human Relations Commission.
So now you have someone that's leased for 2 years.
Yep.
And they become ill.
They develop a handicap.
They develop a handicap.
Yep.
Now I can see where that would be definitely.
You have to allow the modification. You have to allow the modification. And you cannot use that as reason for not renewing the lease. Right. Even if they're, let's say they were on a month-to-month lease and you said, well, no, I don't want you to put in a handicap ramp, so it's best I'm just going to go ahead and give you notice. That is not a valid reason to give somebody notice because, again, you're making a housing decision on the basis of one of those protected classes. Does that make sense for everyone? Yep.
But from my experience with the reasonable accommodations, a lot of times once they find out how much they have to pay, they normally don't do it because it's so expensive and they can't afford it.
Absolutely. I mean, you might see handicap ramps, but that's about the extent of it. Very few people go to the extent of widening doorways, but the law says you have to allow it. Like, for example, we had one case here in Raleigh a few years ago, probably 3 years ago now, and the tenant wanted to rent a house in downtown Raleigh, and they were wheelchair bound, and they wanted to rip out all of the kitchen cabinetry and the bathroom vanities because they wanted ones that did not have lower cabinets so that they could roll under them. And initially the homeowner refused, and the Human Relations Commission said you have to allow them to do it. Now, in that case, they did say, but you can require them to pay to put it back. So the tenant had to pay not only for the modification, but for the change back in that case. But the tenant was willing to pay for it. And so that's what they did. That's what they did.
Well, a lot of times this runs into an insurance issue. I've done, I would say a lot of ramps, but I've built ramps. And they had a roller ramp, which was kind of neat. This was a little and expensive thing. We had to make some modifications, but very small. And then, it was
just basically attach that.
Yeah. It was a really cool thing. It came into the garage, but the insurance company was paying for that. This thing was as expensive as shit.
Their insurance company paid for it.
You had a renter and then said, look, I'm willing to pay for it because my insurance is going to pay for it.
Well, another question that comes up, and this falls under handicapping status, we may as well talk about it, the idea of service animals. We talk about service animals under the ADA. Remember we said service animals are not pets, right? Now, under the ADA, service animals are limited to what 2 species of animal? Remember? Dogs and miniature horses. The Fair Housing Act has no limitation on species. The Fair Housing Act says you can ask those same 2 questions. Do you have a disability, and is the animal trained to provide assistance with that disability? And if the answers are both yes, then that's a service animal. You don't get to apply the test of is it a dog or is it a miniature horse. It's not limited by species. So could somebody have a service snake, for example? Yes, under the Fair Housing Act, they certainly could. And remember that snake, if it's a service animal, is not a what? It's not a pet, which means any pet-related fees do not apply to that tenant. Does that make sense for everybody? So if you were charging a pet fee, could you charge a pet fee for a service animal? No, you cannot. You cannot. Now, can you charge for damage that a service animal does to the property? Sure you can. It's no different than a person damaging the property, but you can't charge a pet fee for a service animal. So that's one example of an accommodation you'd have to make, is to accommodate service animals. Even if you have a no pet policy, a reasonable accommodation would be to allow service animals. And one that we run into with this now is, since you brought up the idea of insurance, some insurance companies have breed-specific restrictions on certain types of dogs. Huskies are at the top of that list. Pit bulls are on that list. I mean, there are certain breeds that are on that list that, you know, that certain insurers say you cannot have in the property, you know, under our policy. I'm telling you, fair housing beats all of those rules. So do not, because we've had landlords that have told people, well, you can't have your service dog because it's a husky and my insurance policy says I can't have huskies in the house.
You need to change your insurance.
Well, you either need to change your insurance, or most likely all they need to do is send a letter to their insurance company saying, this tenant has a federally protected service animal. It is a Siberian Husky, and if you want to tell them no, then I will let them sue you for the $100,000 in damages. What shall I do? And you know what they're going to tell you? Leave the dog alone. You know? And so, just be aware that because this is a federal law, it's going to sit ahead of all these other considerations that people often bring up. Well, my neighborhood, my HOA says you can't have pit bulls. If it's a service animal, it doesn't matter. It goes above all of that. Is everybody okay with that? That's one of the biggest accommodations you might be asked about. Okay? And just remember, when we're talking about housing, that if there is a modification to the property, it's going to be the tenant who pays for that modification. I've had ramps installed over the years. One of the more interesting ones that I had a young lady who was deaf and hard of hearing as a tenant one time years ago, and she wanted to install light boxes around the house, and it had different color-coded lights. One for the timer on the stove, one for the smoke alarm, one for the telephone ringing, one for the front doorbell. There were different colored lights. And so in every room, she installed a box. Now, I'm assuming now that would probably all be wireless. This was, 15 years ago at this point, and so it was all wired, so they had to put little conduit along to each room to install. And of course, we said yes. And she paid for the installation and she paid for the removal when she moved out several years later. But that's a reasonable modification to allow the tenant to do that because she was willing to pay for it. And I actually think she had a grant or something that helped cover the cost. That was a really cool system because, somebody came and rang the doorbell. There was a certain color light that would flash in every room so she would know that something was going on and she'd know where it was, that sort of thing. So some of these things you don't think about sometimes until a tenant asks you for them. You don't even think about needing those sorts of modifications. Age is not a protected class. That is shocking to a lot of people. And that's going to be a tough one for you to get around. I can tell you this is going to be a source of confusion. The two you need to pay attention to as far as protected classes go, one that is and one that's not. Familial status and age. Familial status is a protected class, so it's illegal to discriminate against what? Children. It's not illegal to discriminate against what? Old people. Because age is not a protected class. It's children that are a protected class. You can put up a sign that says no old people allowed anytime you want to. I didn't say it was nice. I didn't say you should. But it's not illegal because age is not a protected class in fair housing. Is it a protected class in some law that we've talked about though?
Yes.
Which one? The Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So, if I put a sign up that says, what if I put this sign up in the front yard? This is a test question. Will not over age 60. And the test wants to know this is a violation of which of the following laws? Number 1, Fair Housing Act. Number 2, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And then, of course, the answer choices are going to be 1 only, 2 only, both 1 and 2, neither 1 nor 2. So that statement, will not rent to anyone over age 60, is that a violation of the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, both or neither? What do you think? What do you think? I got some people say neither. What do you think? I hear another neither. Neither. Neither is the correct answer. Neither. Here's why. Is age a protected class under one of the 2 of them?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It is a protected class under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. But does the Equal Credit Opportunity Act have anything to do with a sign that says will not rent to somebody of a certain age? No. So there's no way this statement could be a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, even though age is a protected class, because we're not getting a what? A loan. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act only applies when we're getting a what? Loan. It could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act if age were a protected class, but age is not a protected class under the Fair Housing Act. You see the distinction there? That's what you're going to have to be able to sort through on a test. They're definitely going to throw age and familial status at you because they know that there is a source of confusion there. So there's no protections on the basis of age. As far as exemptions, this is a big source of test questions. What does exemptions mean? Exceptions. When you don't have to do what? Follow the law. When you don't have to follow the law. Well, the first exception, obviously, is commercial. These are only fair what? Fair housing. So, no commercial transactions. But even some residential transactions are exempt. So you need to know these exemptions. I can tell you what's not exempt before we even get into them. There are no exemptions where real estate brokers are involved. We're never exempt from the Fair Housing Act. And the reason is that we are expected to always know it, okay? One of the biggest exemptions to the Fair Housing Act, though, is the 55 and up community. Now you might say, that shouldn't be an exemption anyway because age is not a protected class. But let me ask you a question. If I say that only people 55 and up can live here, who am I discriminating against? I'm not discriminating against age. Who am I actually discriminating against? Children. I'm saying specifically that children cannot live in the neighborhood. Would that normally be a prohibited statement? Absolutely it would. So how do these neighborhoods exist? These 55 and up communities, and you need to know about it. They exist because they are exemptions to the Fair Housing Act. To become a 55 and up community, the community has to ask for this exemption from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They have to make a request and say, we want to be exempt. We want to be able to have a neighborhood where we can keep who out? Children. We want to legally be able to keep those monsters out of our neighborhoods. 2 rules must apply in order to get this exemption. Number 1, at the time they apply, and from that point forward, there must not be any children at all who live in the neighborhood. Nobody under the age of 18. So from the time the community applies for this exemption, so is it going to be really hard to do this after the fact? Yes, it'd be very hard to do it after the fact. You'd almost, who would have to almost do this before they even started selling properties in there? The developer would have to. It could technically happen after the fact. Like for example, I'm pretty sure my parents' neighborhood up at Lake Gaston could do this if they wanted to. They had one family with small children that lived in the neighborhood and they sold their house there last year. I am almost certain, because there's like 40 or 45 houses in the neighborhood, and I don't think there's a single child that lives in that neighborhood. So I think they meet this rule. The second rule is, at the time you apply to become an exception, at least 80% of the adults, so how many children can you have in the neighborhood? None. Of the adults that live there, so people over the age of 18, at least 80% of them must be over the age of what? 55. So there is some tolerance level for having younger adults in the neighborhood, but the vast majority of them have to be 55 and up. And then you have to follow those rules from that point forward. So I'm pretty sure my parents' neighborhood could do this after the fact, because it's old up there. I mean, pretty much everybody that lives in the neighborhood's in the same life position my parents are. They're retired, they're early to late 60s, they don't have kids that live with them, and so I think that's a neighborhood, if they wanted to retroactively do it, they probably could, but that's very unlikely. And could that be ruined by the next sale in the neighborhood? Yeah, because right now, if somebody comes in and buys a house that has small children, then of course you could not ask for this exception because the rule says you can't have any children that live there. Once it's in place though, what you can do is actively say, no children allowed. Does that make sense? Now, they couldn't do it right now. They couldn't say, well, we're trying to become a 55 and up community, so we don't want to sell you a house in here. Because right now, are they exempt? No, they're not exempt. So they can't do it. But once they've got the exemption, can they then keep children out? Is everybody okay with that? Right? So that's the 55 and up community. You need to be aware. And which piece of the fair housing, which protected class are they exempt from here? Is it all 7 or is it just one that they're exempt from? Just one. Familial status. They're just exempt. So they still can't discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, or handicapping status. Those 6 would still be in place. It's just the familial status one that would fall away for this kind of a neighborhood. We okay with that? We do have several of these neighborhoods in our area around here. Carolina Preserve over at Amberley is one.
Well, interesting enough, a lot of them are surrounded by other communities.
They are. One of the, you find that's very common. They generally are built as part of like a bigger building project that have other types of, like for example, the one over in Amberley, which is Carolina Preserve, was built as part of Amberley, the bigger Amberley development. And it's very interesting. So Carolina Preserve has its own clubhouse, its own swimming pool, it has bocce ball courts, tennis court, different kinds of amenities out there. But the covenants in Carolina Preserve say that, first of all, you cannot have, of course no children can live in the neighborhood, in that subdivision. But it also says that you can't have overnight guests for more than 2 consecutive nights if they're under the age of 18. So your grandkids cannot stay with you for more than 2 consecutive nights. And any guests under the age of 18 cannot use any of the amenities in the community. So if your grandkids do come and stay with you, don't take them to the pool, don't take them down there to the tennis court, because they ain't allowed. It's very hostile to children. Now what they do allow in Carolina Preserve is people who live in that section or live in Carolina Preserve have access to the other amenities in the bigger Amberley. So like for example, if they had their grandkids come over and stay for a maximum of 2 nights and they wanted to take them to a pool, they could take them to the Amberley pool. They just could not go to the one specifically. The one in Carolina Preserve is nice because it's indoors, and so you can't go to grandma's house and swim in the indoor pool. They ain't allowed. It's a 55 and up community. I call it the crotchety old people neighborhood. Other exemptions to the Fair Housing Act. Remember I said these exemptions don't exist when who gets involved with the transaction? Real estate brokers. If a real estate broker is involved, the exemptions go away. Simple as that. There are no exemptions where a real estate broker is involved. You've got to know these for the test. Okay? Rules about the exemptions. No brokers used. You cannot advertise your discrimination. So, when we say no broker is used, who's representing these people? Nobody. They're FSBOs. They're renting it out themselves if it's a rental transaction. You know, if it's a lease transaction, nobody's representing the landlord, so there's no property manager. Nobody's representing the tenant. If it's a sales transaction, it's a FSBO. And not only is the seller unrepresented, but who else is unrepresented? The buyer. So how many transactions work that way? How many transactions in real estate involve absolutely no real estate brokers? Very small number. Wouldn't you say? Because you're talking about no real estate broker involved on either side. Because as soon as you involve a real estate broker, these exemptions go away. Is everybody okay on that? All right? So no real estate brokers at all. No discriminatory advertising is used. So, even if you're exempt from the Fair Housing Act, you can't advertise your intent to discriminate. So for example, if, let's say, all right, so Teresa's not a real estate broker yet. She will be in 2 weeks, right? 3 weeks. But she's not one right now. If she wanted to place her property for rent, could she decide to not rent to someone who has children?
She cannot decide that.
She can decide that because she's not involving who?
Oh, because she's not.
She's not involving a real estate broker. She could make that decision. She could decide that she's not going to rent to a family with children. Is everybody okay with that? But what she couldn't do is put an ad in the newspaper that says families with children need not apply. Because that would be doing what? It's not that she can discriminate. She can't what? She can't advertise the discrimination. She can choose to not accept them. She can even tell them when they come to apply, you're wasting your time because I'm not taking families with children. If she's not a real estate broker and she's not involved in a real estate broker, she's within her rights to do that. Are you following me on this? But what she can't do is put a Craigslist ad out that says, you know, no families with children. By the same token, and we see this all the time. So like, let's say you've got a place in Chapel Hill you own and your daughter is living there. You bought it so your daughter can live in it while she's in school. And she puts a Craigslist ad out because she wants a roommate. And she does not want to have a male roommate. She wants to limit it to female roommates. Is everybody with me so far? Do you think she can do that? As long as she doesn't involve a real estate broker, can she choose to only accept female roommates?
Yes.
She can. What can she not put in that ad that she puts on Craigslist?
Female only.
Female only, or males not apply, because that would be doing what? That would be advertising the discrimination. So the point here is you get the right, you might get the right to discriminate, but you do not get the right to publicly advertise that you intend to discriminate. Everybody okay with that? Very narrow exceptions, yes.
Could she say something like, please call for more specifications?
She could, absolutely, because that's not advertising discrimination.
And she's not having
Absolutely.
a set an actual appointment ahead of time?
Absolutely, and she is free to tell that applicant when they call and express interest, say, by the way, you know, I'm representing myself, I don't have a real estate broker, and I'm only going to rent to females. So don't apply unless you're female.
Right.
And that would be acceptable because they're not involved in a real estate broker and they're not advertising discrimination. Is everybody okay with that? So you've got to make sure you apply this whole checklist. And then the last one is that the owner of the property, whoever owns it, doesn't own more than 3 properties. Because if you own more than 3, you're considered an investor owner and you lose all right to discriminate. So for example, you know, you got 4 daughters and you bought a house, one in Chapel Hill for the best child, one in Durham for the dummy. No, I'm just kidding. But you bought them in 4 different places. Guess what? They would lose the right to even choose to discriminate because you own how many of those properties? 4, which is more than 3. Does that make sense? So it's got to be all 3. No real estate broker involved, no advertisement of the discrimination, and the owner of the property can't own more than 3 of that kind of rental property. So far, so good? So how many of these exemptions are there going to be so far? I mean, but how many, and how often is this gonna be? How common is this? Pretty rare, pretty rare. Because most real estate transactions involve who right off the bat? Some type of real estate agent, real estate broker somewhere. Yeah. All right. Now, it says that rentals are exempt if the owner of the property lives in the property, rents out a portion of it, and owns no more than 4 total units. So rentals get a little bit more latitude even than sales. But notice it says only if the owner what? Lives in it. Only if the owner lives in it. So could an owner who doesn't live in it discriminate? Are they gonna, or have we taken that away now?
He does not live in it.
If he does not live in it, can he discriminate or not discriminate? He cannot discriminate. The exemption says, in order to be exempt, not only do you have to not involve a broker, not advertise your discrimination, but also if it's a rental, you have to what? Live in it. In other words, you're renting out a portion of it. So like it's a duplex and you're renting out the other side of it. You could then choose to discriminate. Notice they don't mean for these exceptions to be very common, do they? Okay? And then finally, property owned by religious organizations is exempt as long as membership in the religion itself is not discriminatory. So, you know, for example, a parsonage. A parsonage might be owned by a church, and they may restrict who can live there to the minister, the preacher of that church. Does that make sense for everybody? And they can do that as long as their practice of choosing their minister is not discriminatory. If they choose their minister and say, oh, well, we'll only hire a minister of this race, then they lose that exemption too. But basically, as long as they're not discriminatory in their other activities, they're exempt. Pretty much religious organizations are exempt from most rules. Okay? Everybody okay? Those are the exemptions to the Federal Fair Housing Act. So look, give me some examples of things that would be exempt. You need to think about this. You need to turn it over in your own brain. In fact, I'm going to give you 2 minutes. I want you to make up a scenario. You write down a scenario where it would be okay to discriminate. And I want you to write in your scenario who owns the property, what they're doing with the property, and how they're discriminating. I want you to write down something that would comply with this list of exceptions right here. Because if you can't make up one, you can't answer the test question. Simple as that. Make it up. We all know you tell lies in your normal life. Make something up. Channel your inner 3-year-old. All right, who wants to share theirs? I'm going to volunteer somebody. Josh finished first. So Josh, what do you got?
Oh, God. Okay, so it's I put an elderly woman who owns a duplex, wants to rent the other side, of the duplex, but she doesn't want the family. She doesn't want to rent out to a family with children.
Okay.
So she places an ad in the newspaper and doesn't make any specific details who can apply. She says call for more information.
Yep. And when a family with small children applies, what's she gonna say?
She's going to say, on the phone, obviously, she's going to say, I'm looking to rent out, but I'm not interested in having children in the duplex.
Okay. Everybody hear the situation? Does that sound like one that would be exempt to you? An elderly lady who owns a duplex, lives in the duplex, she wants to rent out the other side of it, she does not want to rent to families with small children, she places an ad in the newspaper that says, call for more information, doesn't say anything about families with children, it just says call for more information, and when they call, she informs them that I'm not going to rent to you if you have kids. Is that a perfect example of an exemption to the Federal Fair Housing Act? Yes, because she didn't involve who? A real estate broker. She didn't what? She didn't advertise the discrimination, and she is renting it and lives in the property herself. Does that all meet the qualifications of an exemption? It does. Perfect. One more. Who got one? Very rare. Go ahead, Christine.
Sally is renting her single-family home for $1,700. She's had trouble finding renters, so she decides to enlist the services of her brother, who's a broker, for a nominal fee. She tells him that she does not want young singles living there.
She does not want young singles living there. Okay? So define young singles for me.
20s.
She doesn't want 20 singles living there. Okay? Is any of that a violation of the Fair Housing Act?
Yeah. Yes.
She used a broker, brother.
Yeah, she did use a broker, but what is she discriminating against? 20-year-olds. Age. Is age a protected class? No. There's nothing discriminatory about what she just said according to the Fair Housing Act. She didn't need exemptions. You're right. She involved a broker, but you can't tune out these questions. Go, oh, broker, discrimination, discrimination. No, because the thing she was doing was not discriminatory under the law. There is no protection for young singles. That's why I said define young singles, and what did she say?
Over 18.
20s. Can she discriminate against people in their 20s? Absolutely she can. Not only that, can she advertise it? Yes, because it's not a protected class. She can put a sign right out there that says if you're 20 and it's single, you need not apply. Because neither age nor marital status is a what? Protected class. That's a good one. That's a good one. Real good one.
Did you mean it that way?
I was writing it, I was confusing myself. I was like, oh, this is
But that's a perfect example of the kind of thing they will give you. Because what happens is you give up on it, right? How many of you, as soon as she said she enlisted the services of her brother, who's a real estate broker, you're like, nah, can't do that.
I did.
That's what happens. Well, if indeed she had asked the broker to do something that was discriminatory, that would be wrong. But she didn't ask the brother to do anything that was discriminatory. What she asked for was perfectly legal within the law. Maybe not nice, maybe not what you would like to see, but legal. Yes, ma'am.
Could you give another example of the religious organization where you
So let's say we have a small church who buys a townhouse right behind them. It's right behind their property, and they buy a townhouse. And with the intention that they're going to use one, there's 3 units in the townhouse, 3 townhouses within the building. They buy a townhouse building that has 3 townhouses. With the intent they're going to use one as a parsonage to provide place for their minister to live, but they're going to rent out the other 2 to just provide income to the church. With me so far? They could say, we will only rent to Christians.
Okay, that makes sense.
Because they're exempt from the Fair Housing Act as long as they are not discriminatory in their membership overall.
I'm gonna struggle with this because for me it's like I'm having to discern from like a moral standpoint as opposed to like a law.
Exactly, and that's it. You cannot answer these questions from your moral or ethical compass. You know, they want to know, do you know the black and white of what the law is? We're not asking you what would be a good business practice, because in many cases, a lot like what she said, if I'm a real estate broker and my sister comes to me and says, look, I want you to rent my house out, but I don't want 20-somethings living there, I'd be like, I'm not doing that. I'm not dealing with, but that's not what the question is. The question is asking, is that legal? And so, yeah, it's tough to separate because you're not trying to answer it from a moral or ethical standpoint, but just from a straight up, what is the exemption? Everybody okay with that so far? All right. Now, North Carolina also has a Fair Housing Act. We've been talking about the Federal Fair Housing Act. The good news for you is the North Carolina Fair Housing Act looks exactly like the federal version. The North Carolina Fair Housing Act has exactly the same 7 protected classes. Fresh corn, race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and handicapping status. Those are the 7 protected classes. Now, here is what is slightly different, and it will show up on license exams. The exemptions are slightly different. That screen that we just talked about, these things that are exempt in the Federal Fair Housing Act, North Carolina has its own list of exemptions. Sometimes it's more strict than the Federal Act, sometimes it's weaker than the Federal Act. Alright? So let's talk about the exemptions to the North Carolina Act. Is everybody okay? You understand there's 2 laws and 2 sets of exemptions. Alright? Same thing is true as far as no brokers being involved and no advertising of the discrimination. Those things are still true. Everybody alright with that? So you can't involve a real estate broker, you can't advertise the discrimination. You lose the exemption. In North Carolina, FSBOs are never exempt. Under the Fair Housing Act, or the Federal Act, as long as you didn't use a real estate broker, and as long as you didn't advertise the discrimination, FSBOs were exempt from the Act, so for sale by owners. So in North Carolina, if you're selling, you're always following the law. Does that make sense for everybody? In North Carolina, we do not exempt for sale by owners. So pretty much, the North Carolina Fair Housing Act is in effect on any residential sales transaction. There are no exemptions with a residential sales transaction in North Carolina because the FSBOs aren't exempt. Okay, are we all right with that? So in that case, is the North Carolina Act stricter or weaker than the Federal Act? Stricter. It's stricter. All right? The rental exemption. Remember, in the Federal Act, we said rentals were exempt if the owner of the property actually what? Lived in the property. The North Carolina Act says that rentals are exempt if the owner lives in the property or a member of the owner's family lives in the property. So is that more strict or less strict than the Federal Act?
Less.
That's less strict than the Federal Act. Because the Federal Act says it has to be the owner living there. The North Carolina Act says it had to be the owner or a member of their family. You will probably not be asked about this last one. The state basically exempts itself. Rental of rooms in a single-sex dormitory. So they basically say that if it's a dormitory, you can discriminate on the basis of what? Sex. And since the state owns most of the dormitories, they basically exempted themselves. Okay? But the 2 big ones that you're going to be tested on are the first 2 because they're slightly different than the Federal Act. So when it comes to sales, the North Carolina Act is more strict, but when it comes to rentals, the Federal Act is a little more strict on the exemptions. As long as you remember that you never get any exemptions when a real estate broker is involved or when you're advertising your discrimination. Who enforces it in North Carolina? Who does the enforcement? It's called the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. They handle all of the fair housing complaints in North Carolina. Here's what I will tell you. Generally speaking, you don't have to worry about the Federal Fair Housing Act. You have to worry about the North Carolina Fair Housing Act. Because it's the North Carolina Human Relations Commission that's doing the enforcement. Which version do you think they're always going to default to? The North Carolina version. Which really doesn't matter to you as a real estate broker, because for real estate brokers, both laws are exactly the same. The only thing that's different between the two laws is those narrow little exemptions, right? So from a real estate broker's perspective, it doesn't matter who's doing the enforcement because it would be exactly the same thing. All right, now just some vocabulary that you might see on the test as far as fair housing goes. Steering and blockbusting. You need to know the difference between these two. And the primary difference is just who you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a buyer and you commit a fair housing violation, it's called steering. If you're dealing with a seller and you commit a fair housing violation, it's called blockbusting. I had one student one time, I put this screen up, and he mumbled under his breath, "Bullshit." What is that? And I'm like, well, that's not very nice. He's like, no, that's how I remember it. Because he said if it's a violation dealing with a buyer, B,
Yes.
then it's called what? Steering. BS. If it's a violation, if it's blockbusting, it's a violation dealing with who? A seller. BS, right? So he said, as long as I remember BS, I'll keep them grouped together the right way. Blockbusting, I'm dealing with a seller. Steering, I'm dealing with a buyer. It's just the name for a fair housing violation. So if you tell a buyer, no, I can't sell you a house in there because, you know, families like yours really wouldn't fit in over there. Is that steering or blockbusting? That's steering, because who am I talking to?
Buyer.
A buyer. If I walked up to Bo and said, Bo, you need to sell your house, and he goes, why? I said, well, you see who moved in across the street? When people like that move in, property values stay in the toilet, man. You need to get out of here. Is that blockbusting or steering? That's blockbusting because I'm dealing with who? A seller. A seller. That's the only difference between the two terms. The activity is pretty much the same thing. It's committing a fair housing violation. It's just, if it's a fair housing violation involving a buyer, it's called steering. If it's a fair housing violation involving a seller, it's called blockbusting.
Is it possible to look away, like, example,
What now?
you just said something about the value going down, like, is it possible for people that could want to sell to start noticing that their neighborhood is like actually looking better, and it affects them? Like, can it go backwards?
Can it go? But you got to give me more detail. Can it go backwards? Yes. Are you asking me? Can property values go up? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes, and then
Of course they could.
how people sell.
And will it affect how people sell?
Yes.
But what can it not be tied to? Those 7 protected classes. I can't call Bo and say, Bo, you need to sell your property because it's gone up in value because a bunch of blah, blah, blah people have moved in. Because that blah, blah, blah people are all what? Protected classes. That would still be considered what? Blockbusting. Because I'm telling him he should do what? He should sell. He's a seller, so that's blockbusting. It's blockbusting. Or Bo, you would love this neighborhood. You know, I know you got Winston on the weekends, and there's lots of other kids who are in the neighborhood. It'd be a great place for him. That's an example of what? Steering. Steering. Single mom's not a protected class. I can say that all. That's not steering. Not a protected class. Well, I guess moms technically might get you, maybe, but with children's services. Okay, we good? Everybody good on the vocabulary there? We already talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Just remember the difference between which law applies to which type of property. Pretty much, you're talking about commercial property, which law is going to be in effect? The ADA. Whereas if you're talking about residential property, it's going to be what? Fair housing. Couldn't you have like hybrid properties where you'd have both laws in effect? Think of like an apartment complex. An apartment complex, the offices, what law would apply? The ADA. The individual units would be what? Fair housing. Absolutely. So, for example, if you had no units available in the entire building that didn't have stairs, who would have to pay for an elevator? The landlord or the tenant? If you had no units available in the entire apartment complex that did not involve stairs, who would have to pay for an elevator? Landlord or tenant? Landlord. Because the common areas fall under what law? The ADA. And in the ADA, who pays for the modification? The landlord does. However, if you have a tenant who moves in who needs a tub removed and a roll-in shower installed in the bathroom, who would pay for that modification? The tenant would, because that's the Fair Housing Act. See the difference between the two? Okay? So same complex, you could be playing under both laws in different areas of the complex. We already talked about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. This is just a reminder that the protected classes are slightly different, right? The first 5 are the same, but then we add in marital status and age with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Here's the way to handle this on a test. When they ask you, is it a violation of the Fair Housing Act, or they ask you if it's a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, stop, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, are they buying or leasing residential property? If so, then it's going to be fair housing. You need to look and see if they violated fair housing. Are they borrowing money? If so, it's going to be equal credit opportunity. You need to look and see if they've violated equal credit opportunity. Could they give you an example that would involve both laws? Yeah, it could be like Travis is looking at purchasing a home in Happy Meadows subdivision where the developer informs him that they do not sell to people of his religious faith, and it would also be impossible for him to obtain financing as a member of that same religious faith. Which law would that be a violation of? That would hit both of them, right? Because the would not sell to him as a result of his religious faith would be fair housing, and the you could not get financing because of it would be a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Does that make sense? So, you know, you just got to know which part applies to which thing. And then this vocabulary applies to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Redlining. Redlining is a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. They call it redlining because they used to put maps up on the wall. How many of you have ever heard the expression, oh, that's the wrong side of the tracks? You know, that's the bad side of town. Unfortunately, usually that was less of a geographic distinction than it was about the people who occupied that area. And lenders very routinely would have maps on the walls. If you go in a bank, they'd have a map and they'd say, we are not making any loans over here. That's called what? Redlining. It's basically, the idea is that you cannot deny someone a loan on the basis of where they're physically located. You have to apply the same criteria to everyone, regardless of not only those protected classes, but also their physical location. Does that make sense for everybody? That's a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And then just one last note here on this chapter. If you decide to become a realtor, remember that's an optional choice, you're not required. Most of you will end up joining it because you'll end up working in what area of real estate? Residential, and they own the MLS, so you want access to the MLS. When and if you become a realtor, you actually agree to abide by a much stronger non-discrimination clause than the Federal Fair Housing Act. So this is when your moral and ethical standards would come into play. Because the Realtor Code of Ethics has a much stronger non-discrimination clause. If you remember, I actually pointed it out to you previously. When we went through the realtor's version of the listing agreement, and the realtor version of the buyer agency agreement. Remember I said there was a non-discrimination statement in there? And it said, you know, realtors will not discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, handicapping status. And then it said, additionally, realtors have an ethical obligation not to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Those are additional protected classes if you become a realtor. They've started to throw that in as a test question to see that people recognize that that's part of the realtor code of ethics, not part of fair housing law. So for example, if you refuse to rent to, if you're a property manager and you refuse to rent to somebody because of orientation, you would not be violating the Federal Fair Housing Act, but you would be violating what? The realtor code of ethics. So you could therefore be disciplined by the Association of Realtors. You could be disciplined by the Real Estate Commission, you could be disciplined by the state, you could be disciplined by the federal government, but you could be disciplined by your local Association of Realtors. Yep, it's right there. Yep. And that's it for the Fair Housing chapter. Okay? Alright, so let's do this, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we will do the environmental chapter, and you're done.
Wait, have we finished, appendix A?
I think we may have a couple of slides we need to go through, and we'll do that at the end of the